Next, we're going to bring on Haviv Rotchiker. Haviv is the Middle East analyst for the Free Press. Haviv, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Rafaela. Good to be here.
You are obviously in Israel. Tell us, what is the mood on the ground?
You know, it's a little exhausting. People are remembering the June war. There's a lot of fear, especially in the big cities that are targeted by the ballistic missiles, the missiles that take 10 minutes to cross from Iran to Israel and are pretty much impossible to stop. There's been some limited successes, and the technology is always improving, but at the moment, Israel can shoot down drones, Israel can shoot down cruise missiles. It's a much more difficult story with the ballistic missiles. And they brought down a couple apartment buildings last time with people in them. And so there's this very real fear. The local governments and the Army's Home Front Command have mobilized medics and, the emergency crews and things like that in preparation for any eventuality. But I think that mostly Israelis are in that state of grim determination. You know, this is a regime that has told us for 47 years that we are a cancerous tumor and a little Satan. Excuse me. You get to be the great Satan. It's a point of pride to be anywhere in the club that you're invited to, so that's okay. I'll take the little Satan. And they have laid the groundwork in various proxies around us, proxies that have done more damage to their own home countries than to us, Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias and the Houthis of Yemen, for our destruction, for our literal extermination, which they talk about endlessly. And so this has to happen. And I think one view that my neighbors share, because there's a lot of political disagreements on just about every issue, but one thing that I think Israelis all agree on is that they pulled it off again. This was an astonishing opening to this campaign, and it's quite likely, we still don't know, that Khamenei was taken out. And that's, forgive me for talking too long, but that's really, really important to point this out. And I think Neil was mentioning something similar to this at one point, but the very fact that a meeting of Khamenei, the supreme leader, the dictator of Iran for 35 years, the man who built Hezbollah, the man who funded the Houthis, the man who built the nuclear program, this guy, knowing that that meeting was taking place, when and how it took place, within the work hours, right? The daytime bombing is extraordinary because Israel has only really mostly engaged Iran at night. Israeli planes are very good at night. The operational factors are better at night. This was a daytime bombing they did not expect and hasn't happened before. And all these important leaders and advisor on the nuclear program, head of military intelligence, were all in the room. And what that means is the Israelis know when the top, most secretive meetings happen, the most important leadership, the most sensitive leadership, and they know when the meeting is going to happen and where it's going to happen in real time. That alone tells the Iranian regime they are not working together. Somebody is not rowing in the same direction. It breaks the cohesion of the regime. So the psychological impact, never mind the decapitation, which will have to continue for quite a while, but the psychological impact of this kind of a successful start is, it can't be overstated.
Right. And for the listener, what you're saying is clearly there are Israeli and U.S. intelligence sources within the Iranian government high up for this to have worked.
Yeah, and I'd like to imagine a scene out of Tehran, the Netflix show, where it's a Mossad spy running around Tehran, constantly evading Iranian counterintelligence. You know, I'm fairly sure there's some of that happening just because everybody talks about how could it, nobody tells me what the Mossad's doing in Tehran, so I'm allowed to talk about it freely, but you should take it with a grain of salt. But this would be something else. Unless this is an Eli Cohen infiltrating the Syrian high command in the early 60s situation, which is possible, that there's literally a Israeli Mossad spy literally in the high command of the Iranians receiving the coordinating emails from Khamenei's office. It's possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. But the more likely scenario, I think, is that Iranians themselves, Iranian generals, people very high up in the IRGC, are not willing to keep this regime afloat. That the dissension at the highest ranks, They know that their religious justification for this regime, that they're the great war of the humble and the weak against the arrogant and the proud, the great religious war for salvation of all the oppressed people of the world, this basically Maoist kind of reframing of Shia Islam that Khomeini did in the 70s. And that is the religious story of this regime. They know it's bunkum. They know that they're all a bunch of billionaires. They know none of it's true.
Haviv,
And they're
I,
bringing it down.
I want you to stay on. We also want to bring on Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the US, who's going to join the panel right now. Michael, thank you so much for being here as well.
Great to be with you, Rafael, and great to be with Haviv, as always.
Hi,
Michael, how are you sensing the mood in Israel right now? Are you finding Israelis to be broadly supportive of the operation, scared of the retaliation? How are people feeling in your orbit?
As they used to say in the SATs, D, all of the above.
Yep.
Right. The all of the above. We're resolved, we're resilient. I was in a synagogue last night. It's sort of the Shabbat before Purim, and people are dancing around and singing in costume and thinking, this is a nation on the verge of a war. This is Israeli society. How bizarre, but how unique to Israel to exhibit that type of resilience and fortitude, knowing pretty much what was going to happen over the next 24 to 48 hours. Having said that, it's unpleasant, and I think that's an understatement, to have to run to your safe room. I'm not in my safe room now. It's in the next room over, probably about 30 times today. And the booms are sometimes quite loud and shaking the building and getting closer. And since you're dealing with ballistic missiles, which are many times bigger than the biggest missiles that Hamas and Hezbollah can fire at us, that are capable of taking down not just an apartment building, but much of a neighborhood. And that your safe room may not be so safe if actually hit rather directly by one of these missiles. That is in your mind, and you're in there with your kids or your grandkids, in my case, and it is very prominent. So on one hand, we all understand. I think that a significant majority of us understand that this is a war of no choice for the state of Israel. For the United States, maybe a different situation, but not for the state of Israel. That a country which now for 46 years has sworn pretty much on a daily basis to destroy us, and not just sworn it, but has acted on that pledge in Israel, around the Jewish world, certainly in South America and Europe, cannot be in a position where it not just have nuclear weapons, it cannot have a position where it has upwards of 3,000 of these missiles, which present a strategic, if not existential, threat to this country. And should they try to move in Iran to create a nuclear weapon, that these missiles will serve as a shield for them. Basically the same function that they had hoped, the Iranians had hoped that Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and other militias in Iraq and Syria hoped that ring of fire would serve as a deterrence. Now they have the missiles. And we can't be in a position like that. So even if the United States were not to have joined us, as they did this morning, in this daylight attack, eventually Israel would have to operate unilaterally. I think we understand that.
Michael, you've said just now that this war is existential for Israel and Israel's survival, but maybe less so for the United States. People are calling this a war of choice for the United States. Speak directly to Americans who are skeptical of this war, who will say Israel has dragged America into a war that is not core to our national interest. There's already so many conspiracy theories online, and I would love for you to speak to that question and that skepticism.
Well, I'm going to be the stand-in for the president this morning, because I think his speech was very powerful, and I think finally, maybe belatedly, they should have made this case a long time ago. And I was in touch with senior officials in Washington for the last couple of weeks, and I kept on saying, "Why aren't you making the case?" Because this is actually a shut and close case, in the sense that perhaps maybe not since World War II has there been such a profound strategic and moral imperative for acting militarily against a regime. This regime has been responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the Middle East and beyond, including its own people. This is a regime that has been responsible for the deaths of Americans, as the president reminded us today. Not just the takeover of the embassy in 1979, where these Americans were held for hundreds of days, but for the murder of 243 Marines in Beirut in 1943 by the people who developed the Iranian IEDs that were used against American forces in Iraq. He did not mention that Iran hosted for a while the headquarters of Al-Qaeda after 9/11, and that Iran is implicit in terrorist attacks in America's hemisphere, not just in ours, and that Iran is, through Hezbollah, through the Al-Quds force, have tried to assassinate the president of the United States. Other senior American officials tried to assassinate yours truly in Washington, in downtown Washington. That Iran and Hezbollah and its various proxies. There we go.
Michael, do you need to leave to go to the...
Haviv, where are you?
Jerusalem.
Okay. You're lucky. I've had a hard
That's
day
me.
too.
Oh, it's
He's
on
had
your
a-
side. Oh, it's on your side of you.
Should we take a break for 2 minutes, guys?
I'm good.
You're
I can keep
Okay,
going.
good. All right.
If either of you need to leave at any point,
Nah.
just let us know, of course.
At
please
this
do that.
point,
Kids are all in the safe room. I'm fine.
Yeah. Okay.
The New York Times editorial board put out an op-ed this morning.
Wait.
Oh, sorry, did you have another?
Let me just finish this
Oh,
one
sure.
point, because it's a very important point. They're talking about the Iranians' Hezbollah involvement in the drug trade, which is immense. It's vast. And here the president has made this case about going after that the drug trade presents a strategic danger to the United States of America. He didn't make that case. But I'm saying this. I cannot think of many instances over the last, really 80 years where the United States has had such a clear moral and strategic imperative for acting militarily.
Oh, I think the sirens went off. Just so people can really
Available.
understand what's happening on the ground. You said you've heard the sirens 30 times already. Is that right?
Oh,
Did I
yes.
get that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. I think a lot of Americans don't understand what it's like to live under that constantly, not just in moments like this, massive, escalation in Iran, but all the time, through the proxies funded by Iran. And so I just want to underscore that. We obviously
And I would emphasize that once again, that we are dealing with far bigger missiles. And during the many months when we were under fire from Hezbollah, from Hamas, even from the Houthis, the fact that you could go into your safe room and feel relatively safe was always with us. It was extremely unpleasant. You didn't sleep, especially with the Houthis. They kept you awake every night. And many people had emotional problems with dealing with this, but this is of a different magnitude.
Is the reason you're not running to the shelter right now just because you're both so used to it year after year?
No, because Haviv basically shamed me into not going.
And
Because he said, Gever. Yes. No. Actually, I do a lot of international media, as you see behind me, and I do not break for international media for it either. So you don't.
Okay. Same for you, Haviv. That's your reason that the message is important and you want to.
Our guys are flying over Tehran right now. We have people risking life and limb so that everyone else can be calm, can be safe. Journalists have a smaller role than, I don't know what, a fighter pilot, but it's my certainly role to help keep my own family and my people safe. I would add to that. This is an incredibly weak regime. The last thing that it really can do, the only thing really left to it to do, the only survival strategy it has, is causing catastrophic damage to Iran itself, to Iranian society on its way down. And it is braced for it, prepared for it, willing to deploy it, and planning to deploy that. And so, no, I refuse to be afraid. I do urge everyone else to go to their shelters, but
not so different from Hamas in that way, by the way.
Well, let's get back to where we were in the conversation just before the siren came on. As we were talking about, a lot of people are skeptical here. The New York Times editorial board put out an op-ed this morning titled, "Trump's attack on Iran is reckless." And they call his goals ill-defined, and they argue that he's sort of failed to make the case to the American people and failed to say what the day after is. I'd love you to respond to those two critiques. One, that the goals are ill-defined, and two, that it's reckless. Haviv, let's start with you.
I don't think that's a serious argument. It's not. Ben Rhodes said there's no stated objective to this war. Those are patently false claims. It is possible that this war and the strategy will fail. I have argued, and the Free Press has published my arguments, among others, among other arguments, but this one very recently, that this regime is much more resilient than we think. And it is possible that all of the best made efforts of mice and men are not going to get the job done. That is a legitimate debate, a necessary debate. But there is no strategy brought forward by the Democrats. There's no strategy brought forward by the New York Times. The Democrats, I'm referring to Ben Rhodes. There's some Democrats who have serious strategic thinking on these things, and I apologize for making that sweeping statement in that way, but certainly from the Obama folks, there simply isn't a response. Iran doesn't just hate America as an ideology and organizing principle of the regime. Khomeini literally defines the regime as a world revolution against the arrogant powers. And what makes the West arrogant in his terminology, and Khamenei has used that terminology just this week, what makes the West arrogant in this man's discourse, this regime's discourse since the 70s, is that it believes in science and it believes in the physical world and the material world, and it doesn't turn weakness into the great religion, which the Iranian regime does, and the Iranian regime's reframing of Shiism does. And so they hate everything America is and represents. And the only reason that Iran has been unable to kill more Americans than the hundreds and hundreds and all the vast things it did to American troops in Iraq and in Lebanon and targeting America, incidentally, and the West generally, every time Iran goes dark because the regime shuts down the internet, the bot armies advocating for Scottish independence from the UK go silent. Now, I'm not stepping into Scottish independence debates. There's serious debate in Scotland. Let them have it. I'm just saying the desire to dismantle the UK through these bot armies and interference in that way is something that the Iranian regime maintains on a consistent basis. It is anti-West in its foundational ideology, and it wants America to fall. And the only reason it has been unable to cause more harm is that it is desperately weak, pathetic, and incompetent. The Israeli Air Force has now gone to 2 wars against Iran in which the Iranian Air Force failed to take off from the ground. That is the story of this regime. It has gutted everything that country is and has. This is one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of hydrocarbon reserves, and one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of actual outcome of the economy. They have one of the greatest brain drains in the history of humanity. Every Iranian with talent is either a martyr, killed by the regime, or a refugee expelled or fleeing from the regime. And so the story of Iran is a very simple story. This is a regime that is fundamentally, foundationally anti-American, and every time you loosen up on it, it'll be more anti-American, and you're always going to discover that too late. By the way, you take Israel out of the equation, you turn on Israel, they're still going to hate the West and America. People should just literally Google what Ayatollah Khomeini said about America all the years that he ran that regime and founded it.
Here's another debate that's relevant to the moment that we're in right now. Some say Iran does not appear to be close to having a nuclear weapon. Others, and some in the administration, have argued that they're days away from having a bomb. Ambassador Oren, can you make sense of those competing claims?
I can. I'll just add one more thing to what Habib was saying, is all those reasons that Iran hates the United States, hates Israel, it's in their DNA. That's precisely why the New York Times and Ben Rhodes likes them. It's what they have in common. The great attraction of the extreme left in the United States is the anti-Americanism, it's the anti-Westernism. It's why you don't see a great outcry from these same sources when potentially tens of thousands of Iranians are massacred by their own government protesting for liberty. Precisely that reason. You can make sense of it the simple answer would be to go to the more than 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, which the Iranians still have, and which is buried presumably underground somewhere. Now, in theory, you could take that highly enriched uranium, enrich it just a little bit more from 60% to fissile, which is be over 90%, stick it in a warhead, stick that warhead on top of a missile and deliver it. You can also make a dirty bomb out of it, in which case you don't need a warhead and you don't need a missile. All you need is a suitcase. And it's something we have to be very, very careful about. And so in theory, you can reconcile those two claims. President Trump has now done a little bit of gymnastics in the sense of he said, well, last summer he said the nuclear program had been obliterated, and now he said that they're trying to start it up again. And there's some truth to that too. They've been boring under another mountain to make another nuclear facility.
To jump in, people are really confused about this. And so I want to put this into a question to you, which is people are asking, why do we need to strike the nuclear sites now if they were obliterated in June? And so can you go a little deeper on why Trump said they were obliterated if they weren't, and why we're basically doing the same thing again? Is this like mowing the grass in a sense?
Well, according to other sources, including nuclear experts, that the bombing of last summer set the nuclear program back about 1 or 2 years. Which is not a long time.
That's not
Anything
obliterated.
that's not until known time. So partly you have to say to the President Trump, well, maybe they were obliterated, but not obliterated entirely. Okay, which becomes difficult in probably in American political context, but we have to deal with the reality in the Middle East, and that is that Iran's nuclear program was seriously set back, but not fatally so, and not irreversibly so, and that there is evidence that Iran is trying to create alternative nuclear sites for enriching that are more deeply embedded in the terrain than Fordow was, and that was very deep. So yes, but for Israel, the major case, it's not for the United States, but for Israel, the major threat is not the nuclear threat. It's certainly not the most impending threat. The immediate threat is the ballistic missiles.
Another critique people have here is that Americans' attempt to do regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan did not go well. I'm curious what you each make of this analogy. And people are saying they're scared that Iran is going to be carpet bombed, that we're going to be in a long multi-year war for regime change, similar to what the US has seen in the past. How do you respond to that critique?
Well, first of all, the regime change in Iraq did work. Saddam Hussein's not around anymore. There's a different government in Iraq. Okay, it may not be exactly
the critique would be that the region was destabilized. We had ISIS. We had, a power vacuum, and so just to get in the minds of the critic. But please continue.
For the record, America effected a pretty successful regime change in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and so that you can't say historically that regime changes have not proven effective. I think that there's not much choice here with the regime change because it's very similar to Hamas. Hamas is not going to change its DNA. It's the hatred of America, hatred of Israel is what they are about, and that the three principal demands ostensibly made by the American negotiators, by Witkoff and Kushner, to the Iranians, that not just that they cease enriching uranium, that they export the enriched uranium that they had to a third country, perhaps to Russia, that they cease supporting proxies, as they're known euphemistically, the terrorist organizations around the Middle East, around the world, and that they limit their ballistic missiles to a range that would fall short of being able to hit the state of Israel, if not eliminating them entirely. That was basically a demand for the Iranian regime to self-destruct. It is literally what they're about. So they were not. It was regime suicide, not regime change. And so at that point, if you assume that Iran in any constellation, and the Iranians were going to demand, of course, the lifting of sanction relief, which would have enriched them, and that money would not have gone, has not gone in the past, to schools and hospitals and roads in Iran, but to rebuilding its proxies capability in Lebanon and Gaza and elsewhere. You're basically saying, okay, we're going to cut a deal now. This is basically what Obama did in 2015. What was the JCPOA? It was a deal to give the Iranians an immense amount of money in order to delay their nuclear program, just their nuclear program, for 7 to 10 years. That's what it was. And at the same time, they could continue, not just continue, but to greatly augment their support for terror around the world. You look at a map of what the Middle East looked like in 2015 and what it looked like in 2017, how Iranian influence spread. Because that is what the Iranian regime is. That is who the Islamic Republic is. And once you have that there was if you look at that this type of clash almost became inevitable because there was no way of bridging that gap.
There's some questions about how a regime change would actually happen. Obviously, we're seeing airstrikes on political leaders and military targets. There still is, IRGC, which is like the elite military force, the Basij, local militia, and these forces have guns and weaponry, and the Iranian public doesn't have guns. There's very, very strict controls. So even as the US conducts this air campaign, I think a lot of people wonder how that actually practically then translates to the people being able to rise up, given still the power of the IRGC and the power of Basij. And I am curious, Haviv, if you can speak to how that might play out.
A lot of these questions are interconnected. The pieces of this regime that could survive easily a decapitation strike, a very dramatic extended decapitation strike that literally leaves nobody in charge, and you can call that regime change. But as you say, there are still divisions, there's still units, there's still Basij, there's still ideological frameworks, there's still a clerical elite that you haven't taken out all the mosques, right? Which obviously you can't do. And that is enough, especially when nobody else is armed, to maintain a kind of maybe more localized, but nevertheless dictatorship. And so the hope, I think, the strategy, I think, is that a piece of the regime, of the system, Iran has two armies. It has the national army. It's a regular army, like every other country has an army. And then it has that second army, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Well, it exists to export the revolution abroad, obviously, and for all time until the fall of the arrogant powers. But it also exists to protect the regime from the national army, from the actual state and country and people of Iran. And the hope that I think is guiding Western planners, American planners, maybe Israeli planners, is that there are pieces of that regime that look at what's going on and say the current system, where Khamenei for 35 years leads never-ending war and strife, that's not going to work. And that's going to be costly to us increasingly as we go forward, because the Americans and the Israelis, unfortunately, are determined not to live in that world. And so there's another way that all these systems can work, and we will have to get it done. And then there is an internal revolt. Now, if that happens, if the ideology, the conquering revolutionary ideology, the destabilizing ideology, which, by the way, is a profound hypocrisy. I mean, Iranian social media constantly has these viral videos of the lavish lifestyles of these great, holy warriors who lead the IRGC, whose kids are living in the West and have lavish, they're billionaires at this point. They live in gigantic villas, etc. That goes viral on Iranian social media routinely, constantly, like twice a week. And if that accompanied this, the undermining of the narrative of the regime, if Trump said that, he said, Iran is going to run Iran. There's not going to be American boots on the ground. What does that mean? That means we're not doing the job for you. America doesn't have to pay that cost. It doesn't want to pay that cost. It shouldn't have to. Dear Iranian people, this is when you grab your own future by the horns. And he said something very similar to that in his speech. But to really double and triple down on the internal hypocrisy of this regime, I think would be a piece to producing to denying the moral immunity that keeps 10%, 15%, we don't know exactly, of the Iranian population loyal absolutely to the death to this regime. And that's what the Basij really represent. So there has to be a serious information war aspect to this war that destabilizes the story of this regime if you want other pieces of the Iranian state to step into the breach. And, as you said, right, by the way, if we end up with a kind of soft Western-oriented military rule for a time, that's basically what we had in South Korea before it then went and slowly, literally just because it was in the West by that point, economically, culturally turned into a democracy. That would not be a terrible outcome. And Iran seems to be primed for it. It has those levels of education. It has that kind of history. It seems to be possible in a way that it isn't, let's say, in Iraq or in other places the US went in, or Libya. And I'll just say that's very connected to the question of resolve. When Israelis and Saudis and Iranians look at this operation, right, and they try to understand why this operation will be different, which is, I think, 2 questions ago. Why would this be different from Iraq or Afghanistan? So first of all, as Ambassador Oren said, you won Iraq, you lost Afghanistan, but there's complexity there. There's writing all of it off as right, but it's more than that. If I'm not sure America will have this resolved down the road, this is the moment, and there won't be another moment. And that's true for Iranians who want this regime gone, and it's true for Israelis who want to come out of this shadow that this regime casts over the region, and it's true for the Saudis, who we saw an astonishing thing. One missile lands in one spot in Saudi Arabia, an American base, and the Saudis declare they are joining with all of their capabilities the American war on Iran. Now, their capabilities are basically zero. There's no capabilities there. The point is the statement. This is the American resolve that can get the job done. Anything less than this can't get the job done. This isn't something where you can come in and just... So you need the resolve to produce the domestic churning, the domestic uprising, the domestic turning of the regime by forces that have guns, that have power, in order to then deliver on what the American goal is, which is that this ideology no longer rules Iran. This insane ideology that has gutted Iran, destroyed Iran's future, destroyed Iran's prospects, and has been ruling it as this terrible, evil tyranny for 47 years.
Well, if I may, let me just, before you go, Rafael, that I think the resolve is the key word here that Aviv said, and that is The Iranians are banking that the president does not have that resolve. They drew a number of lessons from last summer. One was that the United States joined Iran, the 12-day war, belatedly when there wasn't much danger to American aircraft. It conducted about 14 sorties, and then when the Iranians fired rather performatively at Qatar, the United States immediately backed down and further tied Israel's hands. I think they're also looking at the situation in Gaza, where the administration has pledged to disarm Hamas and has not disarmed Hamas. And they're looking at the limits of American power and how far this president should go. It's interesting that when there were negotiations in Geneva and in Oman, the Iranian foreign minister kept on saying, we're making marvelous progress. It's terrific. We're about to have an agreement. And his audience there was not Iranian. It was not Iran. It was not Israeli. Certainly, it was the United States public opinion, which is running, as you know, very high against this operation. People are going to say, why go to war against Iran when the Iranians themselves are saying, hey, there's a deal right around the corner. Why get us into a war? They're very clever. They were doing that. Very cunning and very clever. They're banking on that. They're banking that they can effect a USS Cole-HMS Sheffield type strike against one of these American warships. And those of you who know, the Cole was the American ships struck in Aden Harbor in year 2000 by a suicide speedboat. The Sheffield was the British battleship that was hit by an Argentinian French-made missile during the Falklands War in 1982. All they have to do with one of these thousands and thousands of drones that they have, or who knows, maybe a suicide speedboat, because the Houthis have them, can hit one of these American aircraft carriers or a smaller destroyer, and cause a reaction in the American public opinion, particularly with the midterms in over the horizon. That's what they're banking on. Very similar again to Hamas. Hamas was always banking on international public opinion to pressure Israel to accept the ceasefire. And we have to be aware. We are now in the first day of this, and there's a lot of excitement. I've done a lot of Israeli news today, and there's a tremendous amount of excitement in the Israeli media about what's happening. And it is extraordinary, not only that the United States for the first time is cooperating offensively with Israel on Israeli soil, which has never happened. They've always had defensive forces here. And that maybe we might be partnering, as Khabib said, with Saudi Arabia and maybe even Qatar at this point in military operations against Iran. That is extraordinary in historical terms. But we're at the very, inchoate stage of this war. And we don't know. And everyone knows how war starts. No one knows how they end. We don't know.
Can I add to that really quick? Sorry.
Very briefly, just because we have Benon Ben Talablu in the waiting room ready to come on. But
there's a big debate. There's a big debate in America right now, totally legitimate, reasonable, serious debate among serious people, not the screaming people outside the room, but serious people inside the room, about the nature of the Israel alliance going forward, about the aid, about the closeness, about whether the interests overlap or not. To do this, to fight this war against an archetypal enemy of America that defines its very existence and politics based on the desire to see America fall and burn. You could not actually fight from Qatar. You couldn't actually base in Diego Garcia because the British government horrifically and shamefully wouldn't let you fly out of Diego Garcia. And in the end, those F-22s had to take off from Israel. And so there are allies that are actually allies. Now, that we've talked a lot about why that is. Israel sees America as leading a world order that is better for every human alive, and it has been better for literally just about every human alive as long as America has been the preeminent world power. There are reasons Israel is that reliable ally. You see it now on the ground.
Sorry to interrupt. We have breaking news from the IDF. They say that they have more strikes underway. And the initial report says that they've begun an additional wave of strikes targeting the Iranian terror missile launchers and air defense systems in central Iran. While I have you both here, if you can just respond quickly to that breaking news.
I'd like to see what happens now with Gaza and what happens with southern Lebanon. Israel has called up now about 130,000 reservists. 70 today. There were 50,000 that were called up before. And that's of course, in addition to the conscriptive army, which is going to be over 100,000. The reason that the IDF issued for these call-ups was to help man the missile defense. You don't call up 130,000 reservists for missile defense. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a job that has got to be concluded, both in southern Lebanon and certainly in Gaza. And I don't know if we're going to get another opportunity like this. So I would say that, yes, we're mounting another wave. Of course, we're mounting another wave. And there'll be waves and waves as the days proceed. But the other issues beside Iran is the unfinished business we have on our northern and southern border.
Well, Haviv and Michael, thank you so much for being here and for responding.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Haviv.
Thank you.
Always good.